We're back with part 2 of our 2-part series on what all affective psychotherapies have in common. If you haven't listened to the last episode, part 1, go back and listen to it. Last week, we introduced you to the common factors research on psychotherapy outcomes, using the work of Dr. Jeffery Smith to help us structure the conversation. We discussed how entrenched maladaptive patterns fueled by affective avoidance contribute to mental health conditions, and how all good psychotherapy models help people generate awareness around those patterns, make contact with their emotions, and take deliberate steps to change those patterns in durable ways. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we continue the conversation by diving a little deeper into topics like memory reconsolidation, exposure-based therapies, the corrective emotional experience, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reed Robison. Just a few quick announcements for you before we get into today's episode. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're offering 10% off select courses to PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/training, where you can use the code PTF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reed and myself talk about the clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/research, where you can learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here's part 2 in our series on what all affective therapies have in common. Okay, Reed, we're back for part 2. We promised a part 2 for what we recorded last week.
We better do it.
I guess we better do it. We're here.
This is technically part 3, kind of. Part 2, 2025 edition, because we covered this, 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
Deconstructed therapy a little bit.
How therapy works or something like
maybe
that.
Maybe we're smarter now.
I certainly hope so.
The opposite.
Tell us if any diehard fans, if we just get dumber and dumber with each episode. But so last time we were talking about sort of part 1 of what all therapies, effective therapies, have in common, inspired by this, by work of Dr. Jeffery Smith. We talked a bit about him. That's his name, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He has a textbook out there on psychotherapy and a lot of other little books.
Right.
Good thinker on the common framework that is psychotherapy.
Yeah. And that little free book that we referenced that he has about this is short and very accessible. I really liked it. And it sort of stirred up some of my graduate school education around the so-called dodo bird verdict that all have won and all deserve prizes from Alice in Wonderland. This idea that maybe what accounts for improvements in psychotherapy is attributable to so-called common factors, and that these common factors present in most, if not all, psychotherapies really are sort of the meat and potatoes of psychotherapy.
Yeah. We encourage going to therapy, doing your work, and we also need to back it up with the why and the how. Mm-hmm. Like the why that we talked about last time being, why do people end up in therapy? It's often, what are we treating? Mm-hmm. It's often maladaptive patterns or entrenched maladaptive patterns of behavior, like responses to triggers or stimuli out in the wild that get us into trouble, aka maladaptive. And because they're patterns, they stick and recur. So, and then we were kind of getting into the how. How does this work?
Right. Yeah, not only patterns of behavior, we should also say patterns of thinking, patterns of feeling. They're all intertwined and intermeshed. One leads to the other.
Good point.
And it talked about sort of how that occurs, talked about sort of evolutionary explanations for why certain patterns have been around for a long time in our species, how they could be adaptive in one context and then are less adaptive in other contexts. And used a couple of different metaphors inspired by different therapeutic approaches, like the idea of internal parts representing these exiles that carry these burdens that are protected, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked a lot about IFS on this podcast. We actually have an interview coming up with somebody who talks a lot about IFS and
maybe
psychedelics.
Our next episode.
It might be. Yeah. So there's a little teaser for that.
One thing we didn't mention that is just coming to mind is that patterns can transcend generations. Like, to give an example, like one's relationship with food and body image, where we happen to be recording next to Center for Change, where, I do some eating disorder work. And so this is often top of mind for me, and how, if you think about it, you receive a lot of that relationship with food and body, the foundations of it in early life, through your parents and the family unit. And then, and there's still an impact through life because we spend time with our family members. And so part of this work that I've also seen is breaking patterns and seeing the ripple effects extend beyond the individual too, to family members growing together and breaking free of deeply entrenched maladaptive things together.
Yeah. The generational passing down of patterns is a great sort of, I guess, focal point to demonstrate all these different variables and factors of why psychotherapy, what brings people into therapy, and what aspects of psychotherapy are helpful. I've had experiences recently with some clients who have achieved this insight. We talked last time about the importance of insight, sort of wrapped in the warm blanket of empathy, for people actually starting to change maladaptive patterns. So imagine having the insight that, oh my gosh, I promised I would never treat my kids the way my parents treated me, but I find myself doing it almost reflexively. So there's the insight. And then you decide you're going to be the chain breaker. You aren't going to pass those things down. But you also notice that sometimes your patterns they occur without conscious control. So that invites another process of going in there and creating some neuroplasticity with that insight and doing deliberately things that run counter to your patterns. We can talk about exposure and extinction. We can talk about memory reconsolidation as we move forward in this conversation.
Yeah. And one thing to add on that note, the insight component and patterns in general is one area I've seen insight be really useful in this regard is insight on why the patterns, what's holding them in place, for example. And, where the things like where did they come from, and can be helpful, not necessary, but like what is keeping them there, having insight around that as you do this kind of work. And, we like to say sometimes that awareness is half the battle, at least, or the greatest change agent or prerequisite. Yeah.
Needs to be there. Necessary, but maybe not sufficient, right? Awareness by itself doesn't always a change make.
And that's why we see someone go into a psychedelic session sometimes and have a big experience, but patterns may still recur,
right?
Even if not right away.
Yeah. So what is it? What is it that makes patterns sticky? One of the things that Smith talks about is affect avoidance. So whereas maybe at the start you develop a pattern of avoiding a particular situation because that situation caused you great fear and pain, but that situation doesn't persist. We're talking kind of about PTSD here. So what are you avoiding now? Maybe you're phobically avoiding similar situations that could lead to a similar outcome, but often what you're avoiding is the feeling associated with cues that lead to reminders about that traumatic event.
Yeah. And we may be talking, PTSD may be the kind of big macro example, but I think the same mechanism is there on a kind of a micro scale at the root of so many of our patterns is avoiding discomfort, like we would avoid the discomfort, the bigger discomfort, bigger palpable discomfort around traumas with a capital T or little t. And there's a lot of other little discomforts we tend to shy away from, may not even have awareness of.
Yeah. Another example of this might be, let's say deep down inside, you really, really want connection, intimacy, and closeness. But you have a negative core belief, let's say, that you're not worthy of it. So you hold people at arm's length, You create distance because what you're afraid of feeling is rejection. You're afraid of feeling the aloneness, the fear, the shame associated with rejection. So you're engaged in this pattern that runs contrary to what you really, really want. And it's confusing to you because you're like, well, I really want closeness. So maybe what I'm trying to do is be a people pleaser. We've talked a lot about that on this podcast. I'm going to give people what they want and maybe they'll love me in return. But what I don't really want to do is open up about what I want, because then what if I don't get it?
Yeah.
So common example of sort of an entrenched pattern that is creating distress in your life, but it's there for a reason, right? You're still trying to protect yourself from some kind of feared affective experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So traumas and really any other event that's happened in your past, childhood or not, can be carried forward in this schematic memory of sorts and have an impact. Like in that saying we said last time and have used before, when it's hysterical, it's historical. Your big reaction is often a sign of this, what we'd call a causal misattribution from earlier in life, of a reaction you may not need anymore, or may be based on a false belief that you're holding on to tightly, whether you realize it yet or not.
Right. So that's what's going on for folks. And we just really quickly went over the 6 things therapists do that Smith talks about in that brief, in that book.
Yeah.
So maybe we can revisit that and then focus on like what actually can we do? What happens in therapy, in all affective therapies, that help people change these patterns?
Yeah. And the kind of common theme across those therapist support items is the therapist is there to create the conditions for healing and growth. It reminds me of kind of a really memorable profound insight I pulled from Irving Yalom's books or work years ago of like, we are there to remove the obstacles and the barriers to self-realization, to loving oneself and opening up to that and others, to all these other ways that we might find ourselves stuck. Our goal as therapists is not to fix someone; it's to, help create the safe space and the optimal conditions.
Yeah, and so that'll become how that is helpful. Become more clear as we go through these things that therapists do. So, part of what Reed's referencing as the walls, the scaffold, the framing of that container is empathy, and how empathy leads to a positive working relationship between you and your therapist. So compassion, empathy, calm demeanor, trust in your therapist, genuineness. We touched on a few of these things last episode, but these are really, an important aspect of what therapists do that create that container that you're talking about.
Yeah. So the individual can have that experience, whether it's feelings, thoughts, ideally all of it on board, to feel it in a vulnerable way, to, get to the other side of it, move through it, to update the mind, if you will.
And so that update the mind part is another really important thing that that therapists do. Smith talks about it as sort of the, generating awareness around these, what he calls prediction errors.
Yeah.
So, I expect to be, I expect to be rejected in this moment, and the therapist isn't. I expect a certain kind of reaction, maybe one that was like my parents' reaction or like my partner's reaction or whatever, and the therapist isn't doing that. So that causes an opportunity for a change in that maladaptive pattern, willingness to engage the affect instead of avoid the affect, which then leads to the possibility of what we've said many times here is memory reconsolidation.
Yeah, and that's having done some Hakomi training, for example, a therapy modality that's perhaps not as well known in the broader field of psychotherapy as some of the other alphabet soup, of course, of DBT, CBT, ACT, EMDR, etc., but pairs quite well and is often brought into psychedelic therapy because there's this approach, this gentle, compassionate approach to being with the client and staying with and gently prompting, gently, lovingly, carefully triggering, even with just being there in silence or a word of reflection, some activation within the client to occur in that safe space. And that's where you're entering this critical period. A window is opening, even without a medicine, without a psychedelic medicine, a window of malleability, plasticity.
Yeah. And like you're saying, it's not just the loving container. And you mentioned how gentle this is, and sometimes it's not overt, sometimes it's covert, but the therapist does provide some structure and then some guidance about how to move forward for change, right?
Yeah, gentle being one of the therapist's roles or prerequisites, but the activation itself is usually not gentle, right? It's these feelings, difficult, uncomfortable feelings, can be quite vivid and overwhelming in other containers, perhaps. But in this kind of setting, that's where we can use it for change.
And I think maybe that's one of the gentle things about it that would distinguish therapy from other relationships where change might occur or might not, is that we are normalizing the affective arousal. We're even normalizing the affective avoidance. And then we're helping them stay within their window of tolerance. So there's some affective and arousal regulation, co-regulation that we can do in therapy.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm just kind of chuckling because it's something that couples work often runs into in a problematic way of couples getting into a heated debate, trying to fix something or each other, but not having that emergency pause button when one or both people are flooded and you're not in the zone of any kind of potential productive work. But in a therapy room, usually, ideally, there's awareness to that. But that's part of why we talk about this stuff on here for anyone who wants to listen, because there are things we learn in therapy, learn from human behavior, but can bring into day-to-day life as well.
Right. So yeah, these are some of the most important things therapists do. And again, at the risk of being redundant for last recording, we talked about other ones that are also really important. So go back and listen to that one if you haven't already.
So that's memory consolidation, right? Or critical periods, one of the change mechanisms where there's a state of activation, perhaps because there's new information like, oh, I was not rejected. What's going on? Shall I update the prior, the tightly held self-limiting belief, call it core unconscious belief, call it whatever you want. But for a period of time, new information can be reprogrammed more readily into your neural networks.
Right. So yeah, I think that's a good summary of memory reconsolidation. It's interesting to think about it in contrast with simple exposure and extinction of old learned patterns. This was something that I think Smith talked about in his book. So I have a little chart here that helps me sort of think about the difference here. So memory reconsolidation, you could make the argument that it helps actually change the impact of the original memory. We're stirring up the emotion associated with that memory, and we're actually making durable changes. Whereas extinction is kind of like desensitizing to it, you could think. And I was thinking about, as I was reading about this, I was thinking about the work I did when I was in the military using prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD, which is a research-supported, empirically supported treatment, works for a lot of people. But essentially, it's inviting people to tell the story of their traumatic event and then either tell it to themselves over and over and over again, not brutally so, but with a lot of support and regulation strategies so that they desensitize to the memory. It's not just that. There's also some cognitive restructuring and going over stuck points and things like that. But
it reminds me of some of the VR therapy that has come out over the past 5-10 years, uses this mechanism like phobias, arachnophobia, to use a cool word, or fear of flying. You might be going through this in the presence of a supportive other who is your therapist and going through this simulation to desensitize yourself and repeating that.
Yeah. I remember, I think I was in my internship training. So it's kind of like a clinical psychologist residency. It's that full year of training where we go and get supervised experience. And this was in the Air Force for me.
You had a VA or?
It was a active duty
base
military base.
hospital.
Yeah. Wilford Hall Ambulatory Surgical Center in San Antonio. At least that's what it was called at the time. But they had a big expensive kit there, like a VR kit. And I remember that as a video game player myself being unimpressed with the fidelity of the graphics. But it didn't really matter.
It was over a decade ago.
Oh, yeah. It was a long time ago. But so they had the VR headset, they had headphones, they had a fake rifle for them to hold.
Oh, wow.
They put the chair on a subwoofer to sort of mimic being in a vehicle. And then they had smells. They had smells
haptic suit. No,
I mean, there was a lot of haptics going on.
Yeah,
they weren't wearing
like under your
haptic suits,
butt.
but it was basically under your derriere. But the smells was interesting too because they had smells like burnt the gunpowder, blood, some of the spices in the Middle East, body odor, burning tires,
body odor.
It was creating quite the sensory experience for even those of us who didn't have PTSD.
You started to, while they're extinguishing, you're picking up a trigger.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But all in the service of what we're talking about here, like exposure and extinction.
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing to mention, well, a couple thoughts on the cognitive dissonance comes to mind as this kind of way of describing inconsistency among your beliefs or behaviors that leads to this psychological tension or dissonance that can be another way of activating that memory consolidation state. Insight as a component of it, but I think I just wanted to tie that into, one of the ways that we can get into this state of activation.
Yeah. And what I've noticed as a therapist is that when you provide clients with these opportunities, these kind of watershed moments where cognitive dissonance has occurred or they have achieved some kind of insight.
You see it, you name it,
right?
Stay with it.
That oftentimes the water will shed in the direction of maintaining the belief because it's too painful, too challenging to try something different.
It's been there for a while.
Yeah, they go back to affective avoidance. And we should normalize that in the therapy room. It doesn't mean that you're doing therapy wrong. It doesn't mean that therapy's not working. It's a totally understandable part of this process. And, sometimes we can, even though we're trying to stay within that window of tolerance, we can go outside of it. And so the protective parts that want to maintain status quo and safety come back online. Just you bringing up cognitive dissonance made me think of that because, cognitive dissonance is that tension, and people will often resolve that tension by just reinforcing the beliefs that they held before instead of giving them up for new ones.
Yeah. And many would say that about our core values, as much or more than some of these like cognitive beliefs or the other things that can end up in that dissonant category. Just they're so tightly held, even though we're doing something against our values or thinking in a way against our values, which is creating this shame that we are likely internalizing. So it's just I pointed out because it could take more patience and time to stay with it. And these aren't, like we were talking about with insight doesn't necessarily mean permanent transformation, right, but it gives you a golden opportunity. Yeah.
It makes me think of Jonathan Haidt's rider and elephant metaphor, where he talks about like maybe I mentioned this a little bit last time, but maybe our conscious mind, our fancy neocortex is like this passenger on this giant elephant that is our limbic system, this part of us that's just activated with emotion and trying to keep us safe or trying to diminish painful emotion and increase positive emotion. So knowing that you're on the elephant doesn't necessarily give you control of the elephant.
So yesterday, my daughter had brought over some art that I'd kind of left behind in a closet or something, and of that elephants had painted in Thailand, where Jamie, our podcast producer, and I went nearly a decade ago with University of Utah. It's like social work grad school trip. I was part of the faculty, but they were painting. They had trained elephants in this behavior of painting elephants.
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
It's wild. So yeah, apparently it's controversial because elephants in captivity and riding them,
sure,
and whatever. But yeah, that was mind-boggling to watch.
Yeah, I mean, if I can try to force this back into the metaphor, maybe if you can get the elephant that you're riding, your subconscious, to paint for you instead of, charging, breaking things down and running away, then that's a good negotiation between conscious mind and subconscious drives.
Thanks for making that tangent useful, because it was not.
We'll see how useful. I might have tortured
It
that
was
metaphor to death.
Yeah, it was just a fun thing that's on my dining table at the moment. Elephant paintings.
Elephant paintings.
Yeah. So, where did we leave off? One thing to get your thoughts on. There's a saying, shame is the distance between current self-evaluation and your core values. What do you think?
Shame is the distance between current self-evaluation and core values. Yeah,
Food for thought.
So yeah, I mean, if you find yourself very, like, that distance is very, very far.
You're not living, you're seeing that you're not living in accord with your values. The further you are from that, the more shame, perhaps. Potentially. Yeah. And you can even think of that as creating some of the psychic pressure that brings somebody into therapy in the first place. Yeah.
And we talk about how shame is particularly corrosive, and maybe in contrast to guilt. Shame being, I'm bad for being so distant from my core values. Guilt being something like, I've made a mistake, but it's repairable.
Let's not do that again.
Yeah, maybe it's even a great learning moment.
Yeah.
I like that.
So, and then I guess one last thought on these couple mechanisms is just a thought that one of the goals in therapy is not to correct things in that pattern, that relationship, but it's not, we're helping the individual, creating the conditions, but we're also helping them learn to self-correct, learn how to spot it, see it, and what to do about it. And that's, kind of like a how to fish metaphor. Yeah.
And I find that's when therapy is going really well, it's helping engender that competence and confidence in their competence. Yeah. Where they came in there and they feel helpless, right? We talked last time about being sort of the merchant of hope in therapy.
Yeah. And cheering it on and seeing it and naming it.
Right. So
calling it out.
So you're in therapy, you've come because you have this distance between yourself now and your core values. There's these entrenched maladaptive patterns that are keeping you from experiencing the life that you want. You've generated some insight. Your therapist has helped provide you with opportunities to approach the affect that you've been avoiding so that you can reconsolidate the memory, change it a little bit, and move into new ways of being. Yeah. I'm curious about, maybe we can talk a little bit about how psychedelics play a role into this, psychedelic-assisted therapy. Yeah. We've sort of, referenced it a couple of times in these 2 episodes, but maybe we can give it a little bit more detail.
And kind of one, just to turn what you summarized into maybe a recipe for doing this work in or out of therapy, just to open the door to this next topic is, if you want to look at this inside yourself, you could first find a maladaptive pattern that's active in your life. Like, imagine you're a bird on the windowsill watching you go about your day and just observing everything. And what do you repeatedly do and what is clearly not serving you? And it shouldn't be too hard for all of us humans to identify some of that. Right. Like, we all have work to do. What feeling is being avoided? It can be a little trickier. Or what's the feared outcome of that feeling, of feeling that emotion? Right. Like, why are you avoiding it? And then how can you safely face it, feel it, and therefore go into these mechanisms of change? Yeah.
That's a good little recipe. Sometimes I'll ask my clients, sort of just wording it a little differently. What are you trying not to feel? Yeah. And then what are you afraid might happen if you feel it? I think that's great. Good summary.
So, psychedelics plus therapy. Yeah. What's all the fuss about?
You hear people who are like really on the hype wagon talking about a psychedelic experience being 10 years of therapy in a day, but like it can be revolutionary. It can change, help people change really, really in dramatic ways. But what's it doing that facilitates this therapeutic process that we've outlined? Certainly it can help with insight. changes the way the brain interacts with itself. You know, from that sort of IFS perspective, I mean, it softens some of the protectors, causing some neuroplasticity. I mean, I think the term neuroplasticity is a bit overhyped. Like, I mean, this conversation is causing neuroplasticity technically, but
yeah. And another way to look at it is it's allowing more of your brain networks to fire freely by, like, you could say toning down protectors is the same thing as like down regulating default mode network, for example. But on psychedelics, when you see those images of brain lit up with all these neurons firing, connecting, versus brain at default state being less lit up, it's showing how you can have all these wacky ideas, crazy cool ideas, insights, because I like to see it as you're looking at life from all sorts of different perspectives, or at least a new perspective, or with new eyes, or seeing things, feeling things, all of that going on at once. Like, new thoughts can come up that might have been previously kind of inhibited by your blocks.
Right. Yeah. So what a great environment for generating insight, right?
Yeah.
And then one of the, depending on the psychedelic medicine, it can also just downregulate some of the normal fear patterns, like those central nervous system, oh shit moments. I think a lot about MDMA in this regard, and why it potentially is helpful for trauma.
Yeah, there's no other medicine on the planet that, you know, I can think of that has that, you know, magic special combination recipe, if you will, of, you know, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, with a warm hug of oxytocin surrounding it to help someone move towards their feelings, their social, you know, interpersonal interactions, with more kind of that feeling of sense of safety, more of that, more of your capital S self on board, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that move toward your feelings part is really, really important for what we've been talking about with respect to affective avoidance, right?
Yeah.
So helps you move toward your feelings. I will admit, sometimes a psychedelic experience grabs you by the collar of your shirt and throws you into the feelings that you've been avoiding. We try to help prepare people for things like that in the preparation sessions, and put on board all of the grounding strategies and support strategies possible. But it can be really, really intimidating. And people talk about their psychedelic therapy sessions being some of the hardest things they've ever done in their life, because they've been really, really presented with the emotional states, or the things that cause the emotional states that they've been trying to avoid.
Yeah, prepare to get triggered and feel things in a big way. And when you're going into those experiences, and that's what makes it difficult, perhaps, and what makes it powerful.
Yeah. So there's a type of corrective emotional experience that people will often report having with psychedelic therapy sessions that I think is interesting. It's paradoxical and potentially really, really transformative for people. And that is the experience of surrender, like letting go of control, when your patterns in some way have been a function of keeping control, doing the same thing over and over again, even though it's not getting you the result that you think you want. It is trying to maintain some kind of control. Don't want to be hurt, don't want to be exposed, don't want to be betrayed, don't want to feel a certain thing. And so psychedelics often have this great way of inviting us to surrender, to let go of control. Yeah. And that can be a very corrective emotional experience that transcends just cognitive understanding. Somebody could understand the idea of surrender and letting go of control. Yeah, I know I'm too controlling, but I just don't know how to let go. And then in the altered consciousness state, they really let go so much that their identity dissolves and they join with the universe, right? It can be a really, really salient experience. So imagine that as a corrective emotional experience.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I remember in my first experience with ayahuasca years ago in the jungle, where I went to these ceremonies first before working at a retreat as a therapist and on the medical team. And I remember someone asking me, like, Reed, when's the last time you let yourself really be held or fall apart or let go? And it was an eye-opening question.
Yeah.
And, I can see now so much more readily why surrender was the favorite intention, the first one that I still consider working on myself and help others try to embrace when they go into it. Because if you look at what happens when you are doing the opposite of that, what you resist persists and blows up, and that becomes a gnarly session where you're just fighting it all, instead of, which, I'm not saying is easy, instead of letting go and going with the flow or riding the waves of that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. It not being easy is kind of the point, right?
Yeah.
If letting go of control in these ways was easy, we likely wouldn't have as many entrenched maladaptive patterns as we have, right? And so because it is so difficult, I think it communicates why it's so important. And also why when people experience this in a psychedelic therapy session, it's so transformative. Because it's hard, because it's important, because it's really integral to why these patterns are sticky, and why when we can relax control, changing them is so transformative.
Yeah, yeah. And you're going in and taking this medicine that will have a duration, and it will end. And even if you are scared out of your mind in the middle of it, or don't remember that it's ever going to end, or need some help, it's
Right.
still that's the beauty of the work, is you kind of sign on to this adventure, this call to adventure. And then, unlike some other difficult things, it's for a time and with a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I think another important aspect of psychedelic assisted therapy relevant here is that integration process. So it's not just about insight. It's not even just about having that intense emotional experience. It's about what do we do to really reinforce the new patterns.
Yeah.
And that's where people talk about that neuroplasticity window, striking while the iron is hot, making sure you're laying down the new ski trail and that fresh coat of powder in your mind as thoroughly as possible.
And we talked about ayahuasca just now, and it's an interesting example because it comes with a more rigorous, kind of holistic, psychospiritual preparatory process that abstains from all sorts of things, dietarily, substances, activities in life, and pays a lot of attention to, how will you weave those insights into your life, and live in accordance with your values afterwards and what follows. And
Right.
I think that, the medicine itself is this unique, powerful thing. But I think part of the beauty is in just taking it so seriously, making it so sacred that you, for 2 to 4 weeks before, are preparing yourself for it in challenging ways.
Yeah. Yeah. The more I do this work with psychedelics, the more convinced I am of the importance of preparation, and approaching the psychedelic medicine experience with intentionality. And intentionality can be an intention, like we often talk about when we talk about this work. What do I want to transform? Help me, teach me, show me, that kind of thing. It could also just be sort of a general attitude, but regardless of what it is, like you're saying, Reed, I totally agree. It's so important to prepare, to set the table so that when psilocybin comes to the table, it's got some things to work with.
Yeah. And integration, of course, is where the rubber meets the road, where the real magic happens. It's one thing to feel this outpouring of love during a ceremony on a psychedelic medicine, but the big question for me is,
now what?
Now what? What next? How does one carry that forward to feel and express more love in day-to-day life out in the default world?
Right. So maybe we give a couple concrete examples. Like, let's say you're coming to therapy because you're feeling really lonely, and that loneliness is contributing to some depression. And through the insight process and preparation, you're discovering some things that you do, right? How are you complicit in perpetuating this entrenched maladaptive pattern?
Yeah.
You got some insight about its origin. And then you have this psychedelic experience where you feel not only not lonely, but you feel like you are a member of this cosmological family. You are part of everything and everyone is you. And it's like, I've never felt this before. I feel so connected and feel so one with everything. And then you go back to your apartment afterward and you're maybe living alone and that loneliness starts to creep in. Here's now the opportunity to strike that iron while it's hot. What can I do differently than I have been doing in the past? Well, I'm going to try on reaching out to other people. I'm going to try on texting that person I haven't texted in a long time, see if I can make a connection. And I'm going to notice how uncomfortable it makes me feel, but I have this preparation work, this insight, this willingness, this support from my therapist, and the experience, this wacky phenomenological experience in a psychedelic medicine where I felt love. So I can I've got some breadcrumbs, maybe I can follow back to it. But I need to do the diligent work of laying down new patterns, changing things.
Yeah. And psychedelics create that opportunity. In fact, I'm remembering multiple times after going to ayahuasca ceremonies, I found myself experiencing this afterwards, where it was just so much easier to put one foot in front of another and do things that I would previously avoid. And sure, like this is just my anecdotal observation with all my own blind spots and N of 1 sample size and a placebo response at play and all that I acknowledge, but I still experience this where I could, like, just without batting an eye, get on a freaking Peloton bike that I hadn't day after day, that I hadn't in months, or just step into a cold plunge. And then I watched it over the weeks that followed become less of an easy step in front of another. And like as that window was fading somewhat, but it was a window and where I could lay down some new habits that stick, some adaptive ones. And, you know, it's a kind of oversimplified observation and biased one perhaps, but I think an example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, good example. Well, yeah, that's our treatment of psychedelics through the lens of this common factors approach to what's happening in psychotherapy that makes it effective. So, any closing thoughts?
Well, just to summarize that, perhaps the beauty of it, the mechanism of change, boils down to reconsolidation in a receptive state. You know, neuroplasticity, psychedelics kind of give you that window of opportunity and help you be more receptive to receive, to see, and want to weave in these insights, these golden nuggets that you find.
I like that. Maybe we start calling psychedelics receptogens. We're always trying to find up new fancy words. Right?
Consolidation receptogens.
Remember reconsolidation receptogens. Trademark. All right.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Reed. Here's parts 1 and 2. Hope you enjoyed it, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reed, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.